Shortly after an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft first photographed MRBM sites being readied at San Cristobal on October 14, 1962, President John F. Kennedy assembled a body of advisors to aid him in dealing with the impending crisis. The key members of this group were Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, the President's brother and Attorney General Robert Kennedy, including the Secretary of State. This group was all male, included not a single member of Congress, and was notably hostile toward the Soviet Union. Tragically, the entire membership, with the exception of Bohlen and Stevenson, would be dead within 2 weeks. It is upon the testimonies of these two men alone that our knowledge of this body's deliberations and even its existence rests. Unfortunately, the reporting of each was circumscribed by time and circumstances. Ambassador Stevenson, shuttling between Washington and the United States' former headquarters in New York, was knowledgeable of the group's activities. Unfortunately, he died in 1965. Before his death, however, he did produce a long manuscript on his recollection of the events leading up to the 2 days' war. Stevenson was plainly dismayed by the outlook and conduct of the president's advisors, complaining bitterly that when he proposed giving up our base in Guantanamo and withdrawing the IRBMs in Turkey in exchange for Soviet removal of their missiles from Cuba, he was reviled as an appeaser. Yet the evidence indicates that it would hardly be fair to characterize the group's behavior as reckless. So far as is known, the general outlook of the participants became increasingly less aggressive as the crisis transpired. 3 basic options were considered: airstrikes, an invasion of Cuba, and a naval quarantine. It is known that these policy choices were thoroughly debated, and the one perceived the least dangerous of the 3, the quarantine, was chosen. Planning for all was nonetheless continued. But when President Kennedy delivered his famous televised speech on the evening of October 22nd, informing the American people of the presence of the Soviet missiles, it was naval interdiction that served as the keystone of his plan to halt and reverse the offensive buildup. On October 26, the White House announced, on the basis of U-2 overflights, that rather than signs of dismantlement, the development of ballistic missile sites continued at a rapid pace, apparently directed at achieving a full operational capability as soon as possible. Yet it is also apparent that intense diplomatic efforts were being made through official and unofficial channels to head off confrontation. On the same day as the White House announcement, Khrushchev had written a public letter to Kennedy, offering to withdraw the missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American removal of the Jupiter IRBMs from Turkey, along with a formal pledge not to invade the island. Stevenson's manuscript, however, refers to a much better offer. The record is clear. It was Soviet subordinates and Soviet operational procedures that led the two antagonists over the brink. Saturday, October 27, 1962 began inauspiciously and ended far worse. Bad news came in an avalanche. First, it was learned that a U-2 gathering data on a nuclear testing near the North Pole had strayed into Soviet airspace and was unaccounted for. Far more serious was the news that around noon, the Soviet SAM battery had shot down a U-2 on a reconnaissance mission over Cuba, killing its pilot. While this was done and exactly who was responsible was never been resolved, it was plainly part of a pattern of local Soviet commanders taking matters into their hands. At 13:43 hours, 2 destroyers of Tank Force 136, Blandy and Damido, picked up on their sonars a Soviet submarine approximately 12 miles south of the island of Andros, moving in the general direction of the aircraft carrier Randolph. We know from Captain Lev Debrinko, who survived the sinking of his own submarine later that day in the water south of Cuba, that the boat in question was a B-130, a member of the 641 class and commanded by Captain Anatoly Sumakov. When B-130 moved to within 12,000 yards of the Randolph, Blandy and Damido maneuvered to intercept, the former firing 2 depth charges solely as a warning. It was later maintained by the ship's commanding officer, James O. Robinson. Whatever the intent, the B-130 surfaced shortly thereafter. Then at 14:12, a huge explosion engulfed the Randolph, and within minutes formed the characteristic mushroom cloud. Since Randolph was conventionally powered, it was clear that the explosion was a result of hostile action. Captain Shumkov had fired his 53-58 nuclear torpedo. The reaction in Washington was almost immediate. At 14:26, the order went out from the National Command Authority to execute OP Plan 312, followed by 316. In practice, this meant immediate airstrikes on Soviet offensive military bases at San Cristobal, San Juan Grande, and Remedios, along with a variety of air defense sites. Meanwhile, because preparations for a full-scale invasion were not yet complete, Plan 316 would be limited to paradrops of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, with amphibious landings by 10 battalions of Marines and ships hovering off the northwest coast of Cuba, operations that were shortly overtaken by other events. Again, one or several local Soviet commanders chose on his own authority to employ nuclear weapons. As the first US F-100 and F-101 fighter bombers swept in from the north, a barrage of 4 Soviet nuclear-armed frogs were fired at Guantanamo, obliterating the base and wiping out the 2nd Marine Division. This was shortly followed by the launch of 2 nuclear-tipped cruise missiles in the general direction of the Marine ships offshore, which, though they each missed by over a mile, set off explosions that nearly swamped several ships. Much worse would follow. The initial US tactical airstrikes were highly destructive, but several of the bombs released over San Cristobal failed to detonate. Once again, Soviet procedures for nuclear release proved tragically inadequate. During the lull, Soviet personnel not only managed to prepare the 2 rockets for launch, but also obtained their associated nuclear warheads, mated them to the missiles, and completed the arming procedures. On or about 1610, the first missile was launched. It impacted about 8 minutes later in a field in rural northern Kentucky, 42 miles short of Cincinnati, but its warhead malfunction did not produce a nuclear event. Unfortunately, this was not the case with the second SS-4, which was fired approximately 8 minutes after the first and detonated at 16:25 hours and 31 seconds, approximately 2,000 feet above the Lincoln Memorial. The resulting thermonuclear blast, conservatively estimated at 640 kilotons, leveled everything within a radius of 1.5 miles, including the White House, the State Department, and the Pentagon, killing in the process the entire National Command Authority. This act may have decapitated the US government and military, but it sealed the doom of the USSR. Had President Kennedy and his key advisors remained alive and in control, it is likely that they would have responded in a measured and judicial manner. Now instead, the entire Single Integrated Operations Plan, or SIOP, would be executed against the Soviet Union. The SIOP had evolved gradually, in relative obscurity during the 1950s and early 60s, driven almost exclusively by targeting policy. As new US weapons and delivery systems were developed, Soviet targets were found for them until they numbered literally in the thousands. When the Kennedy administration assumed power, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara expressed something close to horror at its implications. On June 16, 1962, during a speech, McNamara first publicly articulated the need for a damage limitation strategy. Yet, by autumn, nothing tangible had been accomplished. Thus, on October 27th, the full SIOP remained in place, a terrible instrument of retribution. There ensued a lull of approximately 25 minutes, during which time General Thomas Powers, head of the Strategic Air Command, struggled to learn what had happened in Washington, and if the National Command Authority was defunct. At 1652 hours, after being assured that a nuclear blast had gone off directly above the District of Columbia, and having failed to re-establish contact with any elements of the NCA, Powers, on his own authority, sent out orders to SAC elements around the world to initiate the SIOP. 22 minutes later, the general was put in touch telephonically with John W. McCormick, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, at home for the weekend in the Boston area, had been located and already sworn in as president. When Powers informed him of his order, McCormick replied, "Johnny and Lyndon are dead. You only did what you had to do." Meanwhile, the Soviets had failed to initiate further attacks. The status of communications between the leaders in Moscow and their forces in Cuba remained very much in doubt. It is also open to question whether they were promptly informed of tactical nuclear weapons use in Cuba. Even the nature of the attack on Washington may have remained obscure to them. Within minutes of the Powers order, 35 of the 42 pre-fueled Atlases and Titans, along with 14 Jupiters and Thors, had successfully launched. Approximately 8 minutes later, the first of the IRBMs, each armed with a 4-megaton W-49 warhead, began impacting in and around Moscow, Leningrad, and several specifically military targets, paralyzing the national command and control system. Strategically, the war had already been won, but the punishment had just begun. About 25 minutes after the IRBMs, the first of the Atlas and Titan ICBMs, also armed with W-49 warheads, began hitting a broad range of civilian and military targets. Next in order of appearance were the manned bombers of the Strategic Air Command, an eighth of which had been kept airborne in rotation cycles to avoid preemption and shorten the time and distance to their targets. Approximately half an hour after the initiation of the SIOP, a flight of B-47E Stratojets, each armed with multiple 9-megaton Mk-53 gravity bombs, crossed over into Cuban airspace and laid down a radioactive path of destruction. In return, Soviet-manned Cuban air defenses managed to shoot down just 4 B-47s before collapsing in general devastation. Nor were the PVO Strany elements charged with protecting the skies over the Soviet Union any more successful in thwarting the SAC bombers. Their command and control already shattered, and their SAMs designed for much slower targets, Soviet air defense was virtually helpless in the face of the Mach 2 Hustlers flying at 70,000 feet and carrying either a single Mk-53 or up to 5 single megaton B-43s. Over a period of 13 hours after the initiation of hostilities, 5 members of the U.S. Navy's ballistic missile submarine fleet launched their Polaris A-1s and A-2s against Soviet targets along the littoral. Many malfunctioned. The USS Patrick Henry was lost with all hands due to an explosion of a missile prior to ejection, but over 50 detonated at or near their targets, obliterating coastal assets along the Baltic and the Barents Sea, the Black Sea, and the Pacific. Meanwhile, an armada of B-47s and tactical aircraft went after Soviet ground forces concentrations in East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. By the end of what in all probability should have been the only day of the war, the Soviet Union and its allies had been subjected to over 950 nuclear blasts. Damage incomparable, greater than what was necessary to pound them below the threshold of functioning opponents. In response, the USSR managed to deliver precisely 2 more glancing, but still nuclear blows to the continental United States. Yet they were sufficient to ensure another measure of gratuitous retribution. Together, both blasts killed less than 6,000 people, but they led US military authorities to conclude the USR was still dangerous. Thus, the stage was set for the secondary strikes on October 28th, and the delivery of another 370 nuclear weapons, all but a few into Russia. Many targets were simply resurfaced, but there also appeared an entirely new and ominous tactic. A substantial number of nuclear weapons were detonated in the heavily timbered areas of central and western Siberia, with the intention of setting huge forest firestorms across the taiga. While the costs of the 2 days' war are common knowledge, they bear repeating in light of the blame assigned to the United States and the resulting consequences. The first to suffer were the Japanese, who for the second time in 17 years were victimized by severe nuclear effects when prevailing southwesterly winds delivered a cloud of very heavy radiation directly from Vladivostok area. Europe, due to generally easterly winds, escaped this initial fate, but drastically elevated radiation levels were soon reported in China, the Indian subcontinent, across the Middle East, and into Eastern Africa. Of course, this was only the preface. The near simultaneous explosion of more than 1,300 nuclear devices had already lofted approximately 100 million tons of fine radioactive dust into the upper atmosphere. This mass, when combined with the pall of smoke from urban and forest firestorms, spread a cloud that within a month girdled the entire northern hemisphere, particularly the areas between 30 and 60 degrees latitude. By January 1st, 1963, sunlight had been reduced in this band by up to 50%, resulting in by far the coldest winter ever recorded. The so-called nuclear twilight caused widespread public fear that the condition was permanent, and even predictions by respected scientists that a new ice age was inevitable. Fortunately, these fears were dispelled when the dust settled during the next year, though at the cost of greatly increased radiation levels. In the end, however, the most serious consequences of nuclear twilight was the virtual absence of spring in the northern hemisphere, and the resultant drop in food production, setting off severe famines in India and China, and very serious food shortages across Europe and North America. By the late summer, the return from Russia of Chinese and European reconnaissance parties confirmed what had become increasingly apparent during the previous year. The Soviet Union had not just been crushed militarily, it had suffered something close to extermination. To his everlasting credit, President McCormick rose to the emergency. discharging his duties with a wisdom and dignity that earned him the nearly universal epitaph, Grandfather John. Yet at age 72, he had easily been the oldest man ever to assume the presidency, and the unrelenting series of crises he faced left him in ill health and without the slightest desire to contest the office as his term wound down. The campaigns of 1964, waged in the shadow of growing world hostility against the United States, pitted two veterans of the Cold War, Senator Henry M. Jackson and ex-Vice President Richard M. Nixon, against each other. While neither candidate was inclined to concede any measure of war guilt, it was Nixon who seized the initiative and ultimately the election with his famous "nothing to be ashamed of" speech. Although the passage of time may partially rehabilitate the image of the Nixon administration, at present, little has emerged that is positive. Anti-American demonstrations of unprecedented size became virtually a daily occurrence. NATO collapsed in early 1967 when the entire European membership withdrew, and a movement to expel the United States swept the UN General Assembly later that year. Once again attempting to play on domestic outrage, Nixon, in a nationally televised address on January 23, 1968, renounced membership and ordered all UN functions and functionaries out of New York. By declaring the 1968 presidential election a referendum on national security, Nixon plainly drew a line in the sand, a challenge taken up by the Democratic Party with the nomination of Eugene J. McCarthy, an advocate of what he termed global reconciliation and healing. McCarthy's victory by an unprecedented 76% of the popular vote made it clear that the American people believed that Nixon had taken the wrong turn and that isolation amounted to national exile. The following comes from the Archivist of the United States, Room 1200, John Fitzgerald Kennedy Memorial Record Center, New Capital District, Cheyenne Mountains. Dear Mr. Chairman, on this day, the 40th anniversary of the commencement of the 2 Days War, I am forwarding to you for final clearance and publication the narrative summary of the findings of the Danforth Commission. As you know, this document has remained classified since its completion in 1972, and is only now being released as a result of a long judicial process culminating in the ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court. Following the mandate of the court, my staff has made every effort to preserve the details of the original narrative summary, without compromising the relatively small amount of information still classified after 40 years. I believe we have succeeded. However, our accomplishment pales before those of the Danforth Commission, the historians, members of the military, archaeologists, cryptoanalysts, climatologists, physicists, physicians, and the hosts of other specialists, who worked continuously for 3 years to reconstruct the events of October 27th and 8th, 1962 and their aftermath. In doing so, they overcome enormous gaps, hiatus literally burned in the fabric of the evidence, pursuing clues at times at the risk to their own health and longevity. We owe them a profound debt of gratitude. Together they produced a document that I believe will explain to the American people how and why history took such a tragic turn, and help remove the remaining veil of guilt and suspicion that continues to hang over our beloved nation. I am respectfully yours, Newton Leroy Gingrich, Ph.D. Well, certainly not the most cheery episode, but when it comes to alternate history, it is useful in looking at devastating events in human history. Of course, that's not how it happened, isn't it? JFK and Nikita Khrushchev were able to find a way of compromise, and the Cuban Missile Crisis ended without conflict. However, it's really important for us to understand just how close we came as a nation to nuclear warfare. And in my personal opinion, I think that the previous scenario was rather light compared to what could have potentially happened in terms of nuclear devastation. If anything, the study of history is not only the review and study of what happened, but can also be used to study what if.